Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our midweek study as we are in the book of Ruth and getting near the end, but I hope there's still a few really interesting things I can bring out. We we're in chapter 4, and we did the first part of verse 4 last week, and we're going to take the second part. And has some just fascinating um, maneuvers, if you will, of how Boaz and this unnamed um, uncle, is a closer relative, um, how they how the conversation goes and how Boaz words the conversation and how the local customs of those days are brought out. And so we're going to look at a few of those things today. So obviously they're at the gate of the city. Boaz is trying to negotiate with his uncle, unnamed person, who really has the first right to redeem the family. And this whole thing of redeeming the land and the family, where did this all come from? And so we're going to take a look in the book of Leviticus, and it is chapter 25, and it picks up in verse 23, talking about all these laws and situations that, oh, I admit we probably zoom over really quick if we even read the book of Leviticus. But this plays in very nicely and gives us a hint as to what they're doing. Why is this all happening? What is this land situation? And it gives us an understanding of how God looked at Israel, how he looked at the land, and how he looked at the responsibility of the people of Israel to to deal with this. And so, reading here, what you see on your screen is actually a commentary from what's called Chabad, which is an Orthodox Jewish website, and they include in their comments or input from a middle what do you call it? Medieval, excuse me, that's the word I'm looking for. Medieval sage called Rashi. And so that's what you see expanded here in this kind of smaller print with the brownish highlight box around it. And so, verse 23, this is the book of Leviticus as God is speaking through Moses, giving the laws for how this land is going to be governed once they're settled there. And it says, "This land shall not be sold permanently, for the land belongs to me." This is God speaking. "For you are strangers and temporary residents to the land." Again, very interesting how God. Set this up for them that they didn't own the land, they were just given the land. And again, causes lots of food for thought with us as to, remember, God owns everything. We don't really own our homes. Our work is not really, ours. It's given to us by God. The money we earn is not really ours, but it's God's, and we are stewards of it. And I need to be reminded of that many, many times. And so this all goes back to this book of Leviticus as we're reading here. So the land belongs to me, says God. And verse 24, it says, "Therefore, throughout the land of your possession, you shall give a redemption for the land," and gives one of the causes here, that verse 25, "If your brother becomes destitute and sells some of his inherited property," which is, of course, what um, Elimelech and his family did. Assumingly, they sold the land. We didn't get the understanding that they maybe just left it there, kind of abandoned it, or maybe they sold it. I guess it doesn't matter. That if they sell the land, his redeemer, who is related to him, shall come forth and redeem the sale. Again, this is just an interesting concept of trying to keep the land in Israel, try to keep it in the family, trying to provide a inheritance for the family so that the family can survive. This is all about God trying to provide for them. And it gives a stipulation in verse 26 that if he doesn't have a redeemer, doesn't he might gain enough to afford its redemption. This would be indicative if the person was a Jewish convert and he didn't have any relatives, any history, no grandparents, but he did it on his own. And then he would calculate the years in which the land had been sold and return the remainder. So again, it's calculating who has the land. And this all seems very strange, but Rashi um, explains it for us, and I have it highlighted in blue here. It says that the original owners, and we're going to talk about this year of Jubilee coming up here. The year of Jubilee was a, a festival that occurred every 40th year, and it was basically massive debt forgiveness, massive restoration, hitting the recycle, repause, reboot button, if you will. And all the land went back to the original owners. All debts were canceled. It was like a massive Chapter 11, forgiveness policy, whatever you will. And all debts were cleared, and everybody started all over again in the 40th year of Jubilee. Um, Again, very foreign to our Western, somewhat capitalistic, materialistic concept. But here God is doing a reset. And so this price of the land would be based upon when this year of Jubilee would happen. And so he says, what you're really doing here is you're not buying the land, you're buying the number of yields or the number of years of produce. Like, say, you had this land would issue so many bushels of wheat, you're really paying for the bushels of wheat that would be taken off that land every year because the land is God's and we just benefit from the bounty that the land gives us. I find this just totally fascinating, and it really makes me stop and reevaluate many, many things about how we look at things and how God looks at things, and that the land is His and He's given it to us. And so then verse 28 basically says that if he can't afford to repay him, it doesn't matter because in the year of Jubilee, it'll all go back to him anyway. So all the loans and all the purchasing of land was all based upon how many yields of the land were yet to come until the year of Jubilee, and then it all reverted back to the original owners so that there would be um, no poverty. I guess the purpose was to avoid poverty, to make sure everybody had something and that it would remain with them and stay as an inheritance. And again, just very, very interesting. And that's what we see coming up here as they're talking about maybe the price of what this land would be worth. So obviously, from the time Elimelech and his family left, it has not been 40 years, but yet this time is adding up, and so they're thinking about it in those in that realm. The question I wondered here is why did nobody redeem the land before this? Who took the land? Who owned it? What was happening with the land? Was it just allowed to remain fallow, if you will, and grow wild? Um, we don't have an answer to that question, but obviously this is now the topic that they are redeeming the land. So, verse 5, this is continuing because as he's making this proposition, verse 4 ends and says, this other guy who's unnamed says, "Oh, yeah, I want the land. I will redeem it. Why didn't this come up before? I will go and take it." And then verse 5, Boaz in this negotiating says, "Wait a minute." He says, "On the day that you buy this field from the hand of Naomi and from Ruth, because they were the only two remaining relatives, you must perpetuate the name of the family of the deceased husband, meaning you must marry Ruth and impregnate her and raise up a family." And to make this somewhat more uh, sharp in the understanding is notice how he calls Ruth the Moabitess. He Remember how we talked about this earlier, that the Moabites were despised and hated, and you couldn't intermarry with them. They couldn't enter into the temple to worship or into the tent of meeting and worship. The exception was if it was a female. And of course, there's all this discussion that we went through as to, how did this law come about? Did everybody know about it? How often was it practiced? And so this positioning here of Boaz and presenting this, they say, well, maybe this guy didn't know about this law. And so look at his reaction. So um, as they're talking about what they're going through here, this word perpetuate kind of stuck out to me. And so we're just going to take a look at what this lechachim means, and it comes from the word of kum, and it means to arise, to stand up. Now, this word kum, if you remember, you may have heard this before because if we take a look at Mark chapter 5, and we look at verse 41, Jesus is performing a miracle. The story is captured quite extensively in chapter 5, but then in verse 41, it records some of the Aramaic that which is closely related to Hebrew that Jesus spoke. And he says to her, Talitha kumi, which is interpreted damsel arise. So this kumi, which sounds very much like "cum," is what Jesus spoke when he raised this damsel from the dead. So it's just kind of neat to see these words show up and how the readers or the writers in Mark wanted to preserve the Aramaic that Jesus spoke and put it there and then interpreted it for us, and that we can see these words come up again as we read in the Old Testament. But here it's translated as perpetuate, but it's really to raise up. And we understand that, raise up a name of the dead for the inheritance so that this inheritance can keep going and be perpetuated, and this land can stay in the family. And suddenly this guy gets cold feet. So we see in verse 6 here, and I think this was part of Boaz's plan all along. Remember that, Ruth had just spent the night sleeping at his feet in the threshing floor. There was obviously some feelings going on there, and what was motivating Boaz to be moving in this direction, where previously neither one of these guys thought about redeeming the land until Ruth got involved. So suddenly he says, wait a minute, Viomer Hagoel, and said the kinsman redeemer, Lo Uchal, I cannot legal redeem it. And then he starts giving excuses. Pen ashchit, lest I ruin nachalati, my own inheritance. And again, this is again very interesting positioning. So in this inheritance, he's talking about his own kids, his own family, which means that he was married, that he had children, that he had a wife. Now, of course, plurality of marriages and multiple marriages were, at least we'll say, tolerated back in these times. People weren't quite all, you know, it's totally separated from the way that the culture of that time had influenced them, and you will find this occurring. We know it was not God's perfect plan. It was somewhat permitted, and so this was occurring here in this kinsman redeemer. He's saying, "Wait a minute, I'm not going to get involved here. I have a wife, I have children. I want this not to be messy when I die, and that my own inheritance won't cause a big feud." Many of us have been in those places, and it is not nice. And so he's saying, I just can't do this. And he says, you redeem it, and how it closes it out. And and then it says something very interesting here as it talks about this custom. Again, not a custom that's found in the Bible, but a custom of former times concerning how these transactions would take place and how the redeeming would take place. And we read that in verse 7, that one man would take his sandal off and give it to the other. And this would be a confirmation of this transaction taking place. And again, we look at the source sheets and, it just says, yes, this was a custom. But something just resonated with me, and we're going to see if I don't know if it has any connection, but I thought of a moment here in the book of Mark, chapter 1, verse 7, that I just switched to on the screen. And this is talking about the story of John the Baptist, and Jesus is coming to be baptized of him. And John starts talking about Jesus coming. Remember, Jesus is the Redeemer. He is coming to redeem. And so in the midst of all this, of course, they're talking about John being clothed in camel's hair. And then suddenly he says that there's one mightier coming after me. And he says, the latchet of his shoes I am not worthy to stoop down and unloose. And indeed, he will baptize you with, he says, I baptize you with water, but he, meaning Jesus, will baptize you with the Holy Spirit. Is this reference to this unlatching of the shoe have any reference to a transaction taking place of one who um, was first, who seemed like he was the chosen one? They question, who was John the Baptist? Are you the Messiah? And he says, no. Uh, I'm not even worthy to unloose his shoes. And, that makes sense too. But is there any reference here to maybe this transaction taking place of passing of the torch, if you will, of the moving of this transaction and having to do with this ancient tradition of taking the shoe and giving the shoe as a reference of moving from one realm into another realm, or to work to recognize the one who is really worthy of being the Redeemer. Maybe it's a stretch. I don't know. I've never seen anybody talk about it, but it did seem similar to me. And I thought of this as I was reading about this, what Boaz was doing here with this kinsman redeemer. So again, very, very interesting. We find that this story of John the Baptist talking about this shoe being removed is recorded in Mark chapter 1 verse 7, as I read, and Luke chapter 3 verse 16, and in John chapter 1 verse 27. So why would three gospels record this event of this shoe being removed, um, if it didn't have some significance? So I thought that was kind of interesting. So we're going to stop at verse 7. Want to go back to some of the commentary here and just see what the sage um, Hirsch might have to say. And okay, he talks about maybe there was a bargain here, that he thought maybe Boaz was trying to keep the price down. We just looked at that the price was based upon how many years of produce were going to be there. And so a little bit more commentary on verse 4, that this other guy, Malbeam, thinks that this other redeemer knew nothing about Ruth until Boaz brought it out. And then, of course, in verse 5, when Boaz heard that the kinsman was all, planning to fulfill his obligation, that's when he brought up about Ruth. And that kind of changed the tone of things. And then, it points out some very interesting words here that I have highlighted, that in the original Hebrew text, the spelling of this word to purchase or to buy the land was written in a past tense, um, meaning that Boaz, as at least how they ascribed it, foresaw that he would ultimately be the one who did the transaction. It wasn't in the future tense or in the more of uncertain tense of who would do it. He already used words that says that he's already completed it. And so the sages pick up on this quite nicely, and talk about God's intervention and divine intervention. As we finish verse 6 here, again reiterates about um, this first redeemer not wanting to take a second wife, and a whole lot of discussion about that potential and all the things that could happen if he had two wives in the family. So with that, in verse 7 here, it talks about the removing of the shoe. It was not found in biblical customs, but it was customs of the time and of the age. So again, very interesting. Talks about all of this in great detail about giving a shoe and transferring. Talked about why a shoe was used, because if you took a guy's shirt, it wouldn't put him in a very proper position. Everyone had a shoe, but then the guy still got to walk around with one shoe missing. So again, it's very interesting to think about what was a custom in those days that is very challenging for us to put our own selves in. And there may be some meaning behind there is what it is and what testimony he would have of walking around with just one shoe and what others would look at him and what would they would think. So, well, I hope you enjoyed this lane, little trip down this lane of looking at some of the customs, looking at some of the things that are taking place that maybe you hadn't thought of before. And I hope you enjoy it. So take care, and we will see you again in a couple of weeks. Bye bye.